Okay.
Awesome. We did it. We're live. Mr. Kevin Hart, the founder of Green Check
Oh, thanks,
Verified.
Michael.
Welcome to Around the Coin. Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. Why don't we just kick it off? Give a little background on yourself
Sure.
and what you're
So
building with
a little
Green Check
background
Verified.
on me. I'm an aged nerd. I started out in the late 70s as an assembler programmer. Took a class in college. I fell in love with it, and then I just, I've never left the industry. But when I say aged nerds, my propeller is old, rusted, and bent, but I'm still technically dangerous in terms of understanding what could happen. And so, I've had a long career. I've taken one company public. I've exited a couple to publicly traded companies. I spent over a decade with VCs, private equity companies, working with them for their portfolio companies, kind of fixing them, getting them optimized. So over that whole period of career and working with global companies, I've been exposed to a lot, and I've been on all sides: sales, services, ops, etc. And in 2011, that led me to going to became the CEO, first external CEO of TechServe, which was the original Apple store. And Apple will quietly, under their breath, say, TechServe was the trailblazer and actually the genesis for the Genius Bar, et cetera. So David Lerner and Dick Dominus, great guys, fascinating guys. I had the pleasure of being able to work with them for 3 years. And as part of that, and you and I cross paths a little bit here in your background, the iPads you see in the airports all over the U.S., I brought that to market with OTG. It was point of sale system. And so I ran global point of sale systems before. And the fascinating thing about that, challenge was, how do you take all of those concessions and hospitality and retail environments and service environments inside of an airport, put them in front of somebody, get them to swipe a credit card in a public space, and synchronize the delivery of all that while they're waiting for a plane, and planes are moving, schedules are changing. So that is actually what led me to the cannabis industry. That's convergence.
Wait,
Exactly. Exactly.
so? So you're building. What was it specifically? There was a business that you were running that was building software for
Right.
iPads
So
for
there was a company
airport
called, and is a
restaurant
company
ordering.
called OTG, Rick Blatstein and his CIO, Albert Lee. They wanted to, bring a high class dining experience to travelers. They saw this opportunity of the revenue associated with it. But, how do you do that and not have to build all these bespoke restaurants necessarily per se and be limited by that? And Rick really had some great visions. And so when I saw what they were doing, I sought Rick out and I said, "Hey, you know what? You should really do this on an iPad." I did not know how we were going to do this, Michael. I just knew we could do it. And so the iPads became that focal point and delivery point for the consumers within that environment. And the super cool thing about all of that was the revenue optimization per passenger was on average 45+% higher than when an iPad wasn't present. So those are meaningful numbers when you think about the volume
Oh,
of what's going through the airport. And so that led me back to the cannabis industry because, if you think about, the e-commerce days and some of your background and, people buy what they can see. More importantly, people buy what they can touch and understand. In that environment, cannabis was at the same crossroads way back in 2015, 16, right? Medical only facilities. You have to be cleared to come in. You got to wait behind the velvet rope. You got to meander your way to the counter. And by the time you got to the counter, it's like, okay, what's available? Well, that's sold out. That's sold out. That's sold out. Okay. People were talking about the entourage effect then. People were talking, creating really cool and different modes of dispensing the product, right? Smokables, edibles, tinctures, all these things were really starting to come out. But how did a consumer know what was available? What else should I get? What are the effects? And because the plant is evolving and the cultivation, so I was approached to take that point of sale model from an airport and let's build a really cool point of sale for the cannabis industry. And so I started flying around the country what I knew about cannabis at that point in time, I had forgotten from like 1979, 80 when I was in college. Okay, not a fuddy duddy, but it's just not my thing. And so, and boy, has the science evolved. But anyways, so as we're looking at building this point of sale, and I'm working with Harborside out in Oakland, one of the OGs of the cannabis industry, and learning what that is available, I kept hearing about the banking challenge and access to financial services. And again, because of my background in building tech companies, enterprise tech companies, and scaling, and I'm really more fascinated by what technology does versus how it does it now. You have this intersection of these two highly regulated industries, the whole cannabis industry, and financial and business services. So I wouldn't limit it to just financial services that would love to work together, but they're never going to be able to figure out how, because the rules and regulations on each side are so varied, so complex, and are changing so dramatically all the time. And still, that is a data problem. And so how do you connect them? How do you take the data that's available, and how do you present the data that's needed to each side to solve those individual business cases? And again, having worked in global complex supply chain for part of my career, and looking at that, we layered a supply chain of commerce thinking to the supply chain of the product in the cannabis industry. And that became the genesis of Green Check Verified, in its principles. So that's going back to 2016 and 17. And that was the touchstone.
Yeah. So today, cannabis is legal in
36 plus
most,
states,
or
depends on how you want to count
what?
it, because it's been passed, but is it
Yeah.
live yet? So you could say it's 40 states, but
Right. Right.
actual live sales is 36, and still mixed use, right? Medical, adult, combination.
Yeah, but the pendulum seems quickly swinging towards open access for people across the map. So it's going to take time, I'm sure, and I'm sure marijuana won't be the only. It's interesting to think about how different psychedelic medicines get released, or what kind of
Hmm.
licenses or approval processes they have. But it does seem like marijuana is the most widely used. The impacts of taking it aren't nearly as intense as some of the other drugs or medicines. So yeah, it seems like a good place to start. What's the problem that you guys are solving today? How would
So
you
it's back
summarize
to
that?
access to banking and business services, but we started with access
Hmm.
to banking services, and primarily bank accounts. So cannabis, marijuana, people use different names; they're not interchangeable, but especially marijuana,
Hmm.
Schedule 1 controlled drug. It's
What's the
Man,
difference
you know what? I wish I wish I
between?
wish I could explain the rationale and the thinking, going back to the 30s behind some of this. So, we could get into the whole Reefer Madness movie scene, and the war on drugs, et cetera. But the delineator is the concentration of
Yeah.
THC. Does it have that psychoactive, ingredient above a certain level? And then you'll start hearing about Delta H and hot hemp and everything else. So that's exactly the problem,
Hmm.
right? So, how does a financial institution understand all those rules and regulations, and how do they know that they're letting good money in to the US banking system, and that's their challenge, and keeping bad money out all at the same time? And that is the challenge that we set out to solve. And candidly, we've done it pretty damn well.
So it seems like the challenge I live in Boston, and there's a shop right down the street that I've gone into, and I've asked them because
Correct.
they don't accept credit cards, and that must mean they don't have a merchant processor, which means they haven't been able to get approved, and that's pretty consistent. I've never seen a place that does. There's very few. I mean, you guys are solving this problem, but they tell me that the issue is that because it's federally illegal, even though it's legal in the state, that banks are just not willing to do it, which doesn't make sense to me. Is it a technical limitation, or they're just banks are just too
Well,
scared? I
I
mean,
think
but it's
the biggest
uh,
hurdle used to be, the way I've always classified it is, can you do it? How would you do it, and why you would do it? And we have since flipped that sequence to why, can, and how. But the challenge still remains, by and large, reputational risk. Financial institutions are concerned about their existing accounts and high value accounts. If they start banking cannabis, are they going to lose accounts versus gain business? So they have that. They're worried about their board is concerned, and their senior leadership, and even the people on the compliance team. Am I breaking the law? Am I going to be arrested? Am I going to lose my license? Am I going to lose my livelihood because this is federally illegal? No bank has been prosecuted for breaking the law yet in terms of banking cannabis. Some programs have been shut down, but
yeah, right. Okay.
nobody's gone to the
So,
brink.
yeah. So that tells me there doesn't seem to be any rational reason to be scared if you're a bank. I mean, there's obviously there's some precaution to take, but it seems to me that the banks they're being too cautious and giving up, frankly, like market opportunity. If there's, large scale merchants that want to be banked, but banks don't take them, I mean, isn't that just a matter of finding a bank that's willing to do the
Well,
homework and
you
calculate
have
the
to find the
rational
one
risk,
that's willing to do
or
the
are they
homework.
just
But I mean, and I know this isn't what you mean by it, but you can't dismiss generational biases and thoughts. Okay, it's a federally
yeah,
illegal substance. Hard stop. For a lot of people, it's like conversation over. No, we'll wait until they say it's federally illegal, whoever they are. Right. That's also the challenge. We don't see the market. We don't understand the market opportunity. There's no context for them. Right. So you mentioned Boston, and there's great dispensaries that are visible, but the aftermarket, the illicit market of cannabis in the U.S. is still probably 5+ times greater than the legal market. And so, oh yeah, so cannabis market
really?
domestically, on average, is about $100 billion a year. Always has been, always will be, adjusted for inflation. Marijuana.
This is the
No, just in
this is
general,
not the
just the
legal.
whole
Oh, got it.
size of the market, if you will,
Yeah.
is around $100 billion a year. And so, in today's world, right,
Wow.
at this point in time, we're talking about $20 billion that are going through these state compliance dispensaries. Well, that other $80 billion plus or minus is still being sold all around us, wherever it is else that you can buy weed, right? And so, a bank, can't delineate that, right? And just because you have a license, that doesn't mean that you're not selling product that came through the back door versus allowed through the back door and going out the front door. They still have the same challenges of how they have to operate with AML and BSA and that whole alphabet soup of regulatory guidelines that they have to live in. It's a complex problem.
Yeah. And do you? Yeah. And is the primary motivation the ability to collect
No,
credit cards?
that's
Is
still
that what
lagging.
these?
So the primary motivator for financial institutions today is, banks of varying sizes and degrees, right, are distressed. Okay, financial institutions are consolidating left, right, and center. That's been going on for quite a while. You have the credit unions and community banks that are community based. They want to serve their local constituents, and then you put all the economic pressures, and you have the fastest growing consumer packaged goods segment market. It's right outside their door. I mean, these are legitimate businesses doing billions of dollars of commerce nationally. The banks would like to open the door, but they're still standing on the other side saying, "Go away." We don't know how to do this, and so it goes back to
Mm.
can they do it? But most importantly, the lesson that we've learned, Michael, is why would they do it? You have to give them the context of why uh, having these businesses as customers makes a difference to them, not only in their operations but in their overall community support.
Yeah. Because to me, it seems like the why would be revenue. right? If you're serving a company that's doing, I mean, every time I go to this place down the street,
Hmm.
it's like Main Street, Boston, lines out the door. They must be doing, I would guess the average ticket size is
Pretty close.
like
Yep.
$70.
Yep. Yeah.
You know, you buy two items and you're at 70. And they're probably doing a transaction every minute and a half. I mean, they're just like doing phenomenally, probably the best type of business in the city. And I mean, how many banks now are taking, like, what percent? Let me ask you this: what percentage of marijuana dispensaries are banked in the U.S.?
It's so
Ballpark, yeah.
two answers. I'm not trying to be evasive. There's banked, and then there's unbanked or not banked, and I think that's the difference. And so, depending on the state, depending on even the geography and the type of license within the state, you're still looking at 50 to 75% of these businesses, level one plant touching businesses, that are unbanked or underbanked. Mm-hmm. Yep. Pretty safe.
75%. Yeah. All right. So
Right.
significant
To
percentage,
some form or
25%
fashion.
are.
It doesn't mean they have the banking
Uh,
relationship that they want. It certainly doesn't mean they have the banking relationship that they need to effectively run their business. And it doesn't mean that they're actually not paying more than they shouldn't to actually be able to do that. So
mm,
there's competitive hurdles
mm.
there for them as well.
Hmm. And has there emerged like one or a couple banks that have become pioneers in the space? Like I know in crypto, there's SVB Bank, or there's like two or three that have
Mm-hmm.
just doubled down on crypto and said we're just going to own the market at the high risk but high reward segment. It feels like cannabis would be similar. Are there a few banks that have
There
stepped
are
up and
over 500
taken
banks that
leadership?
are actually banking cannabis domestically in the U.S. today. And the reason why,
Oh wow.
we know that, you would know this, anybody, is that FinCEN publishes, on a quarterly basis, the SAR reports, the suspicious activity reports that get filed. And they break it down by number of banks and number of credit unions. And whether it was, there's three types of suspicious activity reports. And oddly enough, every time they report, about 25% of those reports that they file are called termination SARs, which means they found an account or they monitored an account and they decided they were going to close that business down. So while the number of banks inches up incrementally, 500, it's a small percent of the market. And if 25% of the accounts are getting washed out every quarter, every 6 months too, that's going to still be a low, slow climb to get to where the industry needs to be. And that's part of the opportunity that we saw.
Wow. Yeah. So 25, is it true to say 25% of all cannabis accounts that banks have every
That's
year are
what
being
FinCEN
closed?
reporting shows. Now, and some of
Wow.
that could be,
That's
and
amazing.
again, it's a weird report, right? So if you look at the mega banks, right, and they find out that, you a large portion of your revenue as a landlord comes from because you rent to a cultivator or you're leasing space to a series of dispensaries, they will just look at you, and there's many cases of this, and go, count close, get out. Here's your 30-day notice, 60-day notice, go.
Huh.
There are cannabis industries, and I don't blame these folks, that have opened their accounts under holding companies. And then, all of a sudden, through the account monitoring, they're like, hold on a second, you guys are selling marijuana, aren't you? Yeah, okay, account closed. But that's that small segment. 25% is healthy, but there's still a big segment that says, okay, we know who you are, we know what you're doing. Here's your account. We're watching.
Got it. Got it. Got it. And so you guys will come around and will you sell to the cannabis companies? And you'll say, hey, if we get this green check, then that's going to enable you to get accounts easier.
It works
It's like
that way,
a
but it's a little
verification for the
different.
banks.
So, back to think supply demand, right? We knew we had to have the supply first. So, our commercial accounts are with the banks and credit unions that are banking the cannabis businesses. We do not charge the cannabis businesses a penny. to actually be on the platform. So it's a web-based app that connects the businesses together. But we knew we had to remove the friction for the cannabis companies because they already have a point of sale, a seed to sale. And at the end of the day, they just want to have a bank account. They don't want to have to work harder at this than need be. So that's that connective layer. But we don't charge them anything to be on the platform. And so, because that demand is there, our challenge has to be able to build the supply. And so what we've done, over the past 18 months or so, quite successfully, is we have signed up banks and credit unions. We're operating in 39 states right now with coverage for even programs that are still about to become online, because you have to get your license, you have to have your build out, you have to have those operating accounts to even before you can even swing the doors open. And so, we're in states that haven't even launched their programs. And by the end of this quarter, we'll have over 1,000 cannabis businesses banking on the platform.
Wow. So how
We
do you guys
charge
make
the
money?
banks. So we charge them a setup fee to get this whole
Yeah,
program
okay.
defined within their financial system, because they all have different risk controls and policies and procedures. No two cannabis banking programs are the same, right? But the technology to support them can be the same. It's how you deploy it. No two cannabis businesses are the same. So how do you monitor that account, and how do you verify that the good money's coming in, the bad money's staying out? And that's part of what we built. We filed 3 patents on the compliance rules engine. So we look at the details of that. And so we charge the bank a monthly fee for each account that they have open. And then we charge this very small verification fee for all the money that actually is being deposited, so that the bank can then go to their examiners, go through their audit practices, go through their risk committees, and say, we're monitoring these businesses, everything's above board.
Interesting. Yeah. Is this part of I remember when I would go to
Yep.
MedMen in LA in California, they would they'd
Hmm.
scan your ID, they scan your driver's license. And I assume that that's somehow tied into their system. I mean, MedMen is a pretty unique,
Right.
high profile shop, but a lot of them did, right? And is that part of this idea that it's a program where you're basically tracking the identity of
It's
the
less about the
people
identity of the
buying
people
the
buying. I mean, if it's in a medical program or a mixed use program, you have to be able to segregate that. But it's less about the people. We're HIPAA, PCI, PII compliant, all those things that really matter. But is that cannabis business conducting commerce up against the rules and regulations at that exact point in time for that person, for that purchase. So it doesn't matter that it's you or me, right? But if you're walking through the door every hour in a medical state, and you're just kind of bundling and buying a lot of product, and if the point of sale is allowing that, we would capture that, we would see that, and with those dollars would never be allowed into the bank. Okay, we would block them. We would, it wouldn't be a green check. Cool name, huh? We would be a big reg X, so that the bank actually
Mm.
understands that, versus just funneling money through, because then that in effect becomes money laundering.
Right, because there's a you want to you're trying to, or the bank is trying to block people from purchase. Is there a limit on how much you can purchase,
every state every
like as a
state
consumer
has different rules
per
and
day?
regulations, and that's where the heart of green check, the compliance rules engine, sits. So we integrate to the seed to sale systems, the point of sale systems, and we anonymize the data and in transit and at rest. But we look at it and say, okay, does this transaction meet the rules and regulations at that exact point in time for what occurred there?
Mm, that makes sense. That makes sense. And but it's not tied to the identity. So somebody could come in like 5 times and buy. I guess the shop would try to prevent that, but somebody could come in a bunch of different
The
times
shop
and
would try
buy.
to do that, but
You
we
know.
hash you. Okay. So we don't know that you're Michael, but we know that you are that person. So
Mm,
when, think about that medical environment or even the adult, when they scan that ID, that gets hashed. Okay, so nobody says it's Kevin Hart, but hey,
Oh, okay.
he's back again, or this person's back again. Bam, bam, bam. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's some ID number. Yeah. Interesting. And so how does this look like in the future? It's just I imagine all the states are legal. There's taxes, states are making money on the taxes from the sale of marijuana. The banks are probably less concerned over time because the laws will start to loosen up. Just like alcohol, obviously you can't purchase if you're under 21, but we don't I don't think there's limits on how many. Are there limits on that? Maybe there are in some states how
Times
many
of day, et
bottles of
cetera. But I
alcohol you
think,
can buy or
go back to an earlier part of the conversation. How many
yeah.
bootleggers do you know? Okay. This is that $80 billion, $50 billion that's still being
Yeah.
sold, in the illicit market versus the legit market. I also, you also have the
Right.
challenges of, and I believe this wholeheartedly, and we talk to people in Washington and we're involved with a lot of the regulatory agencies. We're at the low bar now today for what the BSA requirements are. Like, people are talking about Safe Banking Act as a savior and opening the doors for cannabis banking. That is not what's going to happen. And that is not what Safe Banking Act says at all. It says
Mm,
you will not be prosecuted if you are bank compliant cannabis industries, but there's not a period at the end of that sentence. There's a big comma. And it says, provided you follow all the rules and regulations. Okay. So let's think about how this is going to evolve. One, it's Washington. They're never going to have less rules and regulations. They can't help themselves. God bless them for doing what they do, but they're going to make this more complicated. You have the Treasury Department that's not going to, no matter what Congress says, okay, because you can pass the legislation. Somebody has to structure the program. Treasury is not going to turn on and go green light. Let's just let all the money flow in, because you still have this disparity between illicit market and legal market. You still have to be able to stop the illicit money from coming in. You raised the earlier point. Other states are looking at additional products, other psychedelics, mushrooms, acid, etc. Those are coming up. You want to see a banker run and say no? Start bringing that stuff up. Okay, so they're going to want to have to be able to separate those revenue streams and those product streams there as well. And then lastly, the capper, you brought it up, is taxes. Okay, everything that's going to come out of Washington, just like alcohol, has an excise tax associated with it. And if you look at the compounding effect of taxes, and this has been borne out in states like Washington and California and other states that were at the bleeding edge when they went from medical to adult and they started adding all those tax levels, their medical programs shrank. Their adult programs grew, because why buy a medical card? You can buy it anytime without that
mm,
license. But what also happened? The black market activity ramped up because, it's back to your average purchase price.
huh.
At some point in time, pieces of this industry become commodity, right? And so, do you want to spend
Right.
$100 for what you want to use for the weekend, or $145? The effective tax rates in some places is going to be as high as 45% with all the compounding.
Yeah. So
And
it
here and
drives
here
it in
and
under the
here we go
market,
with the
right?
banking
Under the
challenge
in the
again.
black market.
So
So why is it just I mean, what do you think is the foundational psychological effect that says we need to tax it so high? I mean, why not tax it reasonably, like a 10% tax? At 10%, no one's going to like go to a local guy, hook up a backdoor deal. It's like I'll just drive to the CVS and get some. But 45% is like, all right, there's enough
because
motivation
they
there.
don't
Why
they
are
don't think
they
about
I
it. They
mean,
don't think about it in the
just
macro
feels
level, right?
excited.
So, you're in Massachusetts. Why do so many people live in New Hampshire and work in Massachusetts? Because they don't have to pay an income tax in Massachusetts. And then Massachusetts goes, hold on, we're going to find you and we're going to get that money. So it's the same thing. They don't take that macro view. And this has been part of the conversation I've had with a lot of legislatures, et cetera. It's like be reasonable. Don't tax yourself into the black market and tax yourself into a problem. There has been instances where, Connecticut and the tri-state in Connecticut with Massachusetts. So it's beyond the tri-state. It's like, okay, if we all set the same tax levels and we all have an adult program, then people aren't going to be crossing the line. Well, one, that's kind of weird to think about it, but they're public about the conversations, but they just see that opportunity and they're not going to let it by. So people have always paid sin taxes, but you ignore it. But you can't ignore it because you can't go buy a craft beer or a bottle of Cheetos anywhere. But when you walk into that store, you're paying that excise and sales tax, and people start to accept it.
Yeah. But do you feel like there's a difference? Well, you said people are going to
Eventually
just
you'll get
accept
to
it?
an acceptance because then you still have. So if it was $100 million market before and the legal market keeps creeping up and it keeps going up, and there's a lot of studies on this, I'm not the economist, where in 2025 it's going to start to balance. It's going to be about 50-50. Okay. there, you know would you rather go to a nice dispensary and be able to browse the products and understand the other options that you have? Or do you want to meet somebody in the parking lot and he's going to hand you a bag and you're going to throw your cash in the car and go, okay, one, whew, I'm glad I didn't get arrested. Two, I have no idea what I just bought. I know what he told me. I know what that person told me, but is that
Yeah,
really
yeah.
what I have?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You know what? You know what we got to do? There's going to be, I feel like there's going to be an explosion. Super high taxes would incentivize people not just to purchase on the black market, but in the case of marijuana, unlike alcohol, it's pretty easy to grow. I mean, especially if you just smoke it, you just, right? Like alcohol is
Mhm.
kind of hard. I used to brew my own bear in college and it was pretty difficult. Like, and it
It
never came
worked,
out
but
good. It was always
it tasted
terrible.
bad.
So, whereas like, yeah, I don't even know it worked. But it was like we had the barometer floating around, all the bottles around. It always smell. It was like always a risk of contamination. Whereas it's literally weed. It grows like a weed. You just, I mean, I've never grown it, but I assume you just pick it, dry it, and there you go. And you can make other products that are more complicated, but it does feel like the market of
And
people
it
just
has.
growing their own
And it has.
grow, and
And then
maybe that's
some
a good
states are
thing. Maybe
looking at
they'll,
that program. I mean,
yeah,
right now, Connecticut is supposed to vote this week about what they're going to do for their adult rec program, and home grow is part of it. And then, but you have big money behind that. Like, no, we don't want that. We want you to have to come to the dispensary. You have the people like, law enforcement going, okay,
yeah.
how do I know where you got that? You have the banks, still the same thing, right? Just because it's home grow personal use doesn't mean you're going to sell it. So, okay, it's one plant, it's 10 plants, all of a sudden it's 100 plants. And there's instances, there was one in Las Vegas recently where a compliant business was, grossly overgrowing their size of crop and selling it to legitimate businesses, but it wasn't tracked effectively.
Hmm.
Tracked.
It wasn't
They
packed
they
effectively?
they tracked.
Interesting.
They actually
Uh,
tracked the plants. It's
oh,
really kind of
tracked,
cool.
tracked. Wow, that sounds a little overbearing
Safety
in
of
some
product,
ways.
safety of
Uh,
product, safety for the consumers.
yeah, 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 it makes sense. Who are the people now who are against this? I mean, what is the most like intelligent conversation or perspective you've seen from people who are like, no, we shouldn't legalize this. We keep
The
it the way it
industry's,
is.
it's really amazing how much the industry and the thinking around it has changed in the 5 years that I've been involved. So you still have a lot of the old. It's a gateway drug. Yeah, that one's
Gateway,
still
yeah,
there and
yeah.
it's going to be there for a long time. There are just a lot of people that just have a visceral moral, objection to it. That's it.
Yeah, they've been the
Yeah.
80s, the war on drugs was legit. I mean, those I remember those
Hmm.
pancakes, those eggs
Yep.
flipping in the pan, like this is your
Well,
brain.
you're the
This
right
is your
age. You
brain
probably
on
went through a
drugs.
DARE
Yeah,
program
they were
at
effective.
school, right? And so, they
Yeah, Dare
compressed
was huge.
everything into that. And, for me personally, it was, I went to an event at Harvard Medical School. So I can say I went to Harvard. I went to an event there, and these physicians from Israel, and I forget the gentleman's name. He's the super legit person, and he went through this whole spectrum of studies they did on autism in children. I get goosebumps still thinking about that event that day, and they talked about the effect that cannabis was having, marijuana, cannabis, that all the breakdown of it on these children that had autism, and then how the plant mutated even in this super controlled environment that they had. I mean, hyper controlled. This is FDA on steroids over there. And they were scratching their head and they're like, what the heck happened? These patients were regressing. Another one. They looked at the plant. They're going down and they're like, everything's the same. What changed? They went to the next level down. It's well past my science. And they found this little thing that changed. It's like level 23, way down. That changed. They were able to re-engineer the plant, okay, because it evolved. And they put it back, and everybody went back to their prior level of functioning because they didn't know, did they reach a saturation point or whatever. And this was not bullshit science. This was pure legit science. And I was like, this plant makes a difference for a lot of people. And if you look at the medical history of it and how that's evolved and the studies, and we're still limited here in the US on where you can even university studies or medical studies, it still gets shipped overseas a lot. It's real. It's absolutely real. And so, a lot of people still just have to become educated on, the value of the plant. But it's like anything else. You can abuse it or, you can use it recreationally. It's personal choice.
Yeah. 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 There's probably, in reality, hundreds, maybe thousands of different types of plants and combinations of plants that yield
Mm-hmm.
medicinal benefits that we haven't come across yet. I mean, I would bet there's a whole spectrum. I mean, that down in the rainforest that is probably known to some extent by people who have local indigenous knowledge. And the Western mind tries to synthesize it, encapsulate it, put it in a pill, regulate it, and then sell it
And
to healthcare
monetize it.
companies, and that monetize it. Yeah. Which, doesn't quite feel like the purest intent. I don't know. I mean, marijuana is a nice one because the brand hasn't been tarnished all that much. It's like it's relatively simple, and if anything, negatively, it conjures up laziness, you know, absent-mindedness, clumsiness, but it's not like, you're not a threat to society, right? I think we've largely people concluded that it's probably worse to encounter a drunk person at 2 a.m. on the street than it is to
I
encounter
would
someone
I
who's
would agree
high
with
on
that. Yep.
weed. So
But
yeah, yeah,
it's all
yeah. You're
those
just you're
things,
just
right, that
less.
we've been talking about here that stack up against, the legitimacy of it, right? And, how to then, it comes back to how do these businesses, and, these are some very sophisticated operators and they are becoming big business, but how does everybody across that spectrum, 20,000 plus businesses all across the country, be able to walk into a bank, looking like me, looking like you, or looking like, Cheech and Chong, right? Straight out of the movie. And like, hey, the state says I'm a compliant business. Yeah, I'm selling marijuana. I want a bank account. It just doesn't work as well as you would think
Hmm,
because of the rules and the complexity. And so that still has to be addressed.
yeah. And there's
Just
500
over
banks. How
nine
many banks
over
are there in this
9,000.
country? Do you have any idea? 9,000. Is it
Oh yeah.
hard to start a
Well,
bank, or is it
it's
like
it's
a
it
yeah?
the rules and regulations around starting one are pretty much the same. They haven't evolved that much. More rules and regulations after the last financial crisis came out, safety and soundness and things like that. But you could start one, but it's hard and it's a competitive market. And if you look at just the banking industry today, when's the last time you went to a bank, COVID or not? Right? You don't need to go, and so the banking model has changed dramatically. Niche banking is something that's very real. And you even see for the larger banks, they turn themselves into cafes, Capital One, it's a Starbucks. It's not a
Mm,
bank.
I know.
In Boston, you can't go to a grocery store without
Uh,
walking past a bank now, and yet you still don't go to it. And so,
yeah,
it's that whole model. But
yeah,
you're still talking about these highly cash intensive businesses with a lot of money, right? That's got to go somewhere, and that's not conducive to walking into a branch of a bank with duffel bags full of cash for a whole host of reasons, obviously.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost the fact that you can't get a bank account makes it more sketchy because then you have to have, a giant safe with cash in it, only accept cash. And that means you have to probably hire a security guard because people know
Hmm.
that there's a giant safe in there with cash. Now you got a security guard and you're a cash only business and you kind of like look sketchy from the outside. So there's still, it's still a little strange. Do you guys work with any countries or banks outside the country and other countries, or have learned anything about how other
We've
countries are
always looked
pioneering
at
this
the other countries.
challenge?
So even when we filed our patents, well before we even wrote the first line of code around the technology and the business processes, we were always looking at the global market. So we have aspirations of being able to go outside of North America and U.S. territories. So there are U.S. territories where we're in conversations with folks now today. So it goes beyond the 50 contiguous states.
Any idea what country is leading in terms of like banking or acceptance regulatory
Well,
wise
the bank,
for
in
cannabis?
general, the banking systems there tend to be little less defined and a little less controlled. Uh, just their
Yeah.
economies and general demographics just require that. I think the next emerging market that's going to be very, very interesting, candidly, is going to be Mexico. Yeah, and so right
Yeah.
now, and the reason why I feel this is right now, every state that has a cannabis program, everything has to be done within the state. Interstate commerce is not allowed. Okay, and so very, very shortly, so you have the whole
Wow.
Safe Banking Act, and you have the whole financial services, but then you have the drug itself, and people talking about descheduling it and criminal expungement. All for that. They should make it happen. All those rules, but then interstate commerce is going to come. Going to get even more complicated. Back to more rules, not less. But then international commerce, I think, is not that far off down the line. So Canada and then Mexico in general. Okay, there's a reason why cannabis has been coming across the border for decades and decades because they have a great grow environment and they have the availability. A
Yeah.
pound of cannabis to grow in Mexico versus trying to grow a pound in Massachusetts or Connecticut or Vermont, completely different price points. And again, if it's the same product and you're going to get to commodity pricing, you're going to start seeing that global supply chain really start to work its way into this system, either at the raw material side or at the finished goods side. And so that's when the rules and regulations are going to get even
Huh.
more interesting, for the financial system.
It's, so it's a lot cheaper in Mexico because they get more sun or they
They
have
didn't have to build
better growing
a
conditions.
million square foot warehouse. They walked outside and they said, "We have acres of land. Let's grow it." Okay.
Yeah.
They still have to test it. You have to
Yeah.
do all the things to care for the plant. This is it's a weed, but it likes a lot of love and care. To grow to be what you want it to be for the testing. But you don't have to
Mm.
put in how many millions of watts of power for grow lights and air conditioning, climate control, and mold and pesticide and ventilation and irrigation and security, et cetera. So that's just the fact. And so if you go to other states
Yeah.
that have a similar climate
Yeah.
or a longer growth cycle, I mean, I like fresh tomatoes. Okay. Our grow, I'm right down the street from you. Our opportunity for fresh tomatoes is limited to 2 months out of the year around here. Okay. You know, I can go get a tomato any day of the week in
Yeah.
Mexico or Florida or California.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah. 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 Well, I'm a big fan of just legalizing. I mean, I'm not in control of all the laws, but it does seem like we have to go through a worse situation before it gets better in terms of the complexity of the business side of things, but at least it does seem to be moving in the right direction. And like you said quickly there, but I agree with strongly, is like people who have sold
Wrong.
marijuana and they're in jail. It's like, what are we doing? We're paying. First of all, we're probably paying $200,000 a year, some
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous amount of money to keep people in jail, and then they're perfectly sane, you know, people that would be productive and happy in society, but yet they grew a plant and sold it to somebody
Yep.
else, and now they're locked up, and like
It's
that.
wrong. It's just flat out
That's
wrong.
terrible. So,
But
is there are we moving in that direction, or are
yeah,
any states letting
yeah,
people go for
they absolutely are,
misdemeanor?
and
Yeah,
more are talking about it. And there's a lot of conversation down in Washington, around expungement, especially of federal convictions, right? There's state, but then the federal convictions. But
yeah,
it's like anything else associated with this industry. It's complicated. What was it armed sale? Was it another ancillary crime associated with it, so how do you draw the rules? So there have been some states where it was up to x number of pounds, if this was the limit and then you were arrested under, okay, you're expunged and you can wash away. But then all of a sudden, there was one example, I won't name the name, it was up to 3 pounds, and all of a sudden it went up to 25 pounds. It's a big difference. If you sold 3 pounds of weed, that's a lot of weed. But now all of a sudden you went up
mm-hmm,
to 25 pounds.
mm-hmm.
That's an enterprise. So, and I'm not saying it was right, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Hey, just think about what this think about what this guy would be
Exactly.
doing if he was starting his own company. He's just
Hmm.
so much entrepreneurial potential behind bars. No, it's a shame. I think generally this is the parallel psychologically between the policies that were put in place with things like cannabis and psychedelics, is that the what we took the hammer approach and just said, you do it, you're going to jail. Like, not no medicinal purpose at all. People can't even research it, which is just crazy to me that we marked something as Schedule 1. You can't even research it, and then if you do it, you're going to jail for a long time, and that doesn't really produce a happy society. It produces a lot of people in jail and a lot of people
Hmm.
struggling with mental illness, which is what we see today. And if you take the funding that we would spend on people in jail and you said, well, let's pay social workers, let's pay people to help those people who are struggling in life for whatever reason, integrate back into society. The goal should be getting people in society, if at all possible, not to lock them up as soon as they do something wrong, because that's not
No,
really, I
it
mean, that
doesn't.
doesn't help
You know
anyone in the
what?
long
You know what,
term. So,
Michael? Not picking on
yeah,
you.
yeah,
You sound like the conversations we have with people, that a lot of folks that work in the bank, right? How do I separate that
yeah.
complex problem? How do I know that I'm dealing with a legitimate business, and that I'm not breaking the law myself, and I'm actually facilitating commerce versus enabling something I shouldn't be?
Yeah, yeah. Do you feel like there's intelligent conversations happening in Congress or
Yeah,
in
I
politics
do. I think
about
there's a
this?
lot of desire. I think each time, so everybody gets excited. The House voted. They voted on the same thing as ostensibly 4 times. Yeah, the language changed, and you never know what it is until you get it, right? But they have that conversation. I think you see more and more people coming to vote. But then I also think you see with the Biden administration talking about it. It's not a political stance at all, anybody, but talking about it pre-election, then all of a sudden anybody on the staff that smoked marijuana or raised their hand, they started firing people. Whoa. You can't have, yeah, oh, that happened. You can research that.
What?
So you can't. They
What
tested
is that?
members of the administration and staff, and they said if you use marijuana and or had a prior conviction, et cetera, they started laying people off. Now they've backpedaled that and softened it a little. He hasn't
When
been
was
there that
that?
long. So between January and now, but go back to March, April, you'll find that, right. And so,
Jesus.
but the thing to me that's the most interesting, and I don't think Safe Banking Act is going to pass this year. Okay, I'm glad people are excited. I'm glad that more people see that this is going to happen. All right. But it's still a question of when. Okay. It's no longer if. It's moving along. But the fact that the Fed isn't talking about it yet is all I need to see or hear to know that it's not going to go anywhere. And they have real big problems that they're trying to solve. It's not even on their radar until the Fed raises their hand and they engage in the conversation. Again, Congress can pass a law. It doesn't mean it gets implemented because the rules and regulations and everything else around it still have to be written after the fact. And you still are going to have a lot of arm wrestling, fighting, and control points
Mm,
that are going to get introduced to it. But the good news is it's moving in the right direction. Yeah,
mm.
it is moving in the right
Fascinating
direction.
stuff. Yeah, yeah, it does seem that's true. Well, I'm happy to support you guys, and congrats on all the progress you guys have been making. It sounds like you're doing all the things to push society in the right direction. So, yeah, keep on doing your thing. Is there anything that you're looking for, whether
We
it's
are always
hiring
hiring.
people
Yeah, we
or,
are
I
always
mean,
hiring.
any shout
And,
out there?
again, there are financial institutions out there that are serving this industry today. They're not going to just necessarily raise their hand. They're not going to take a billboard out and say, hey, we're open to bank cannabis businesses. But, the fact that we've been able to grow with as many accounts that we have in as many states and bring as many businesses on board is an indicator that this market is growing in the right direction. And I think further, the fact that we get the support that we get from
Mm,
examiners and people that are in these regulatory agencies that are encouraging banks, support your community, but do it right. This is about doing it the right way. And
hmm.
that is going to constantly let everybody else, because they all talk to each other, right? Especially, every professional sector talks to each other. As they see more and more people doing it, we're going to see more and more support for the industry.
Awesome.
Anytime,
Kevin, this is fun, man. Thanks for
anytime.
coming on. I really enjoyed
All
our
right.
conversation.
Be well. Thanks.
All right. Take care, man.